Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video we're going to be analysing the poem This Winter Coming by Karen Press. So as always we'll start with a little analysis of our poet so that we can understand the context and the framing behind this poem. Karen Press is a South African poet, writer and translator who was born in 1956, and she's published short stories, poetry collections and even a film script. And this leads us to our discussion of the context of this particular poem, which I would highly recommend you read more about. I'm just going to sort of try and summarize it into a few sentences for you, but there's a lot of information out there, and I would definitely recommend that you research it, not just for the purposes of this poem, but also just for the purposes of having an understanding of South Africa's history. So this poem was published in 1986, and the 1980s in South Africa was a very tumultuous period. Obviously, the apartheid government was in control of South Africa, but it was very, very close to democracy because democracy came in 1994. So the 1980s had a direct effect on the creation of the new South Africa. But during the 1980s, there was a lot of resistance against the apartheid government, but there was also a lot of retaliation. So there was increased resistance, but there was also increased oppression. There were reforms that were being created, but there was a lot of violence, and it was a very eventful period. And all of these different contending forces really resulted in this period of uncertainty. And that's what this poem is really focusing on, this theme of uncertainty that's created by the resistance movements and the apartheid government sort of, colliding at once in the 1980s, both really powerful forces during this period, and it really created an eventful decade. And that uncertainty is the major theme of this poem. So if we look at our title, This Winter Coming, we start off with a demonstrative pronoun. A demonstrative pronoun are words such as this, that, these, and those. And what they do is they really make something focused or specific. So it's not just a winter coming or the winter coming, even not even using those articles, but this winter coming. It really makes it important and significant. The use of winter, as we're going to see, we can read this poem in a literal and a figurative way. So literally, if we think about the connotations of winter, we think of negative, icy, dangerous conditions, right? When winter is coming, if you think of like animals, even they go into hibernation or they have to, collect resources. When we go into winter, it's the same sort of thing. There's this like level of fear that we need to prepare for this danger that's coming up ahead. And so we can think about this as, a literal poem as the winter is coming and people are feeling uncertain and feeling unprepared. But really, we have to also understand this poem in a figurative aspect. And this winter is representative of this increased oppression, increased resistance, resulting in this period of uncertainty. Coming, as we can see here, the ing, and the ing really creates the sense of immediacy. It's like coming, it's approaching, it's like, almost engulfing us. We're going to see throughout the poem, the poet or the speaker speaks about being, almost not in the middle yet, but having this period of uncertainty already has begun, and this winter coming is going to come and sort of engulf everyone. So it's a sense of immediacy, and this title in general provides this ominous, foreboding mood and tone that we're going to come to recognize comes throughout this poem. In every single stanza we have that foreboding, ominous feeling. It sort of makes us feel that way. So that's our title. Now let's get into these actual stanzas, the actual poem itself. Walking in the thick rain of this winter we have only just entered, who is not frightened? Okay, so stanza 1, a really interesting stanza, setting the scene up for us. If we look, we don't start with a capital letter, which of course as an English teacher sometimes drives me mad, but this is being used intentionally, right? Because do you see, once again, the use of the ing, the use of the participle is showing that we're already in that space. We're sort of like in the winter already. We've just entered it and now we're walking more and more towards it. And obviously winter here is functioning, as they said, a metaphor of uncertainty. We're walking deeper into this despairing sort of energy. Walking in the thick rain, it is quite interesting because I'm no weather expert, but geographically in South Africa, the rain is usually a summertime thing, except perhaps in the Western Cape. So it is interesting, and I think perhaps maybe it's reading too much into it, but it's really the fact that we're expecting rain and winter. It's just really emphasizing how dangerous this uncertainty is, or how scary and fearful the speaker is feeling, because we've got the winter and we've got the rain. And the rain is obviously significant because here it's described as thick rain. It's heavy and dense. It's filled with despair and negativity. So starting with the lowercase letter and the ing participle, the winter has already started and we are in the midst or the middle of it. Of this winter, we have only just entered. So we've already started this period of struggle. I also want to just talk about winter, and I could have spoken about it in the title, but we can speak about it now as well. But if we think about winter, we spoke about, the fact that it has this ominous nature and that it's sort of threatening and has these connotations of danger. But it's important to remember as well is that winter is a season, and so ultimately it will pass. So the speaker is talking about this period of distress and perhaps speaks to how change comes after a dark period of time. So she's talking about we're entering this sort of season of winter where, in order for meaningful change to take place, maybe there needs to be some upheaval. Maybe there needs to be some sort of uncertainty in order for actually, a positive outcome to happen, right? That's perhaps what she's thinking here. But putting it as a season is slightly more optimistic than maybe what the poem comes across, right? Because the poem comes across as something extremely sort of pessimistic or depressing, or this theme of uncertainty. But the fact that it's a season, she's saying winter, it's a season, it's going to end, there is going to be the summer that comes after it. We can understand that to be a slightly more optimistic thread to this argument. Notice the enjambment. So enjambment is the run-on lines, and so you see here she doesn't end on a full stop in the first line. She's actually continuing the same sentence over 2 lines, and this enjambment goes throughout the poem. There's numerous instances or examples of it, and this really emphasizes the continuation of winter. And it's that ing idea as well, that participle idea. It's like you're walking into winter, you're being absorbed by it, it's continuing on. And so that enjambment really emphasizes the continuation of winter and the distress of it seems to go on and on and on. Who is not frightened? So this rhetorical question ends mostly every stanza in this poem, and so we can call it something called a refrain. And you can think of it almost like a chorus in a song. And we'll discuss it later on when it's repeated, but just notice how this refrain is really adding to that fearful and scared tone and mood that we have of this poem. It's a rhetorical question, and that rhetorical question obviously engages with the reader and the audience. It really makes us feel it emphasizes how fearful we feel, because we're now sort of drawn into it, and we ask this question and we need to imagine these circumstances for ourselves. The wording or the phrasing of the question assures you that you are frightened, that being frightened is the default. If you are not frightened, you are the exception. So it's not who is frightened, which is sort of implies that, okay, most people are fine and some people are frightened, but who is not frightened? This wording implies that by default you are frightened, and if you're not frightened, then you're the exception, and that's strange. So you can see this just adding to this mood of fear. The sea is swollen, churning in broken waves. Around the rocks, the sand is sinking away. The seagulls will not land. Under the sky, the shroud falling. Who is not frightened? So, stanza 2, we start off with some natural imagery. And whenever we have natural imagery in poetry, we can always interpret it in the literal sense, right? If you have winter coming in here, the sort of description of nature implies, a storm is approaching or some dangerous weather is approaching. So we can see that in a literal sense that, we got to get ready because this winter storm or this winter energy is coming forth and it's filled with negativity and we've got to do something about it. But when we look at natural imagery figuratively, and I'm saying this in general because it's something you can think about applying to your unseen poetry analysis as well, is typically when everything is right and peaceful in nature, then it indicates a sort of peaceful tone, or things or whatever is being figuratively associated is something positive. But here we can see that the sea is swollen, churning in broken waves. You can have lots of negative natural imagery, like nature is not at where it should be. It's not at its peaceful point. It's not something positive that's going on. And so there we can really understand the figurative energy. We can understand the uncertainty, like nature itself is bubbling with uncertainty and with fear at what's happening. The sea is swollen, so there we have a sibilant alliteration, the repetition of the S sound, and this imitates or emphasizes the swelling of the ocean. If you think of something being swollen, it has quite negative connotations. It's almost like it's filled with, horrors of change, or not change necessarily, but in this case with uncertainty, right? Churning in broken waves. Churning indicates this disruptive, uncomfortable, distressing idea. It's going to wreak havoc on everything. In broken waves, so we can see something is not right in nature. It's violent, and this reflects the figurative interpretation of the poem. Something is not right in South Africa. Something's going on that needs to be changed or needs to be settled. Around the rocks, the sand is sinking away. So around the rocks, it's still going around. It's trying to knock them over to inspire some change. So we can see this as a bit of a metaphor. If you think about like the ocean coming over rocks, right? Rocks are sort of immovable. It's very difficult to move them. It was very difficult, if you think back to history, to upend the apartheid system. The apartheid system the rocks almost represent the apartheid system, and the resistance movements is like the ocean coming to knock them down. But it takes years and years. It takes a lot of resistance for the water to actually come and completely take the rock away. The sand is sinking away. So here we have more sibilant alliteration, the repetition of the S sound. It emphasizes the sand is slinking and sinking, sort of like, I feel like you can think about an hourglass in this case, like the sand slipping, and it's almost like time is running out. There's so much uncertainty. It's like, when is it going to sort of reach this climax and things are all going to go crazy? The sand is you can think of the sand as being absorbed into the ocean, and it's only a matter of time before the rocks are going to, cede to the pressures of the ocean. So we can see in that way as well, like the little things, the sand, there are little things changing, right? Because during this period, there were little things changing. Little sort of victories for the resistance movements. And so like the sand is being absorbed by the ocean, and so these little things are being worked out. And so maybe these big things, the rocks, the big sort of policies of apartheid and the apartheid government itself is going to come. So soon the big things as well. The sand sinking also shows a lack of stability. There is a difficult winter coming up in the country. So we can sort of see this image in 3 different ways. So just to summarize, so we have the firstly, we said it's like sort of like time running out. It's like this hourglass that's, the sand is sinking. We can also see it in terms of in a positive way, in the sense that if the ocean is representative of resistance and the rocks are representative of the apartheid government, the sand sinking away shows that the resistance movement is making progress. But we can also see it in the sense of, if sand is sinking, right? Imagine you're standing on a beach, or think of those like, quicksand even, and the sand is sinking and you feel like you're sinking. There's a lack of stability. You don't have any sort of ground to be on, and that really emphasizes the unpredictability and the uncertainty of this time period. The seagulls will not land. So if you think about what we said about nature, the seagulls not wanting to land, that's something, they sense the danger, and this is something that's really should be off-putting to, well, not off-putting, but should really emphasize the uncertainty and the despair of the situation if even seagulls don't want to land. This could also, if we sort of analyze it deeper in terms of the figurative aspect of this poem, it could perhaps also refer to the sanctions and disinvestment in South Africa. So during the 1980s, international and foreign countries and companies didn't want to associate with South Africa because they recognized the racism and the oppression that was happening in the country. And so a lot of countries disinvested, and they took their companies out of South Africa. A lot of them also, a lot of countries put sanctions on South Africa. They weren't allowed to participate in certain events. It's like no one actually wants to be associated with South Africa, and so that's what the seagulls could represent. The enjambment, once again, we see it here, and it's almost like the winter's climax is approaching. It's just, there's momentum. The enjambment really emphasizes the momentum of what's happening and how we're going to reach this, all this uncertainty, all this unpredictable, all these unpredictable aspects sort of going to reach its climax, which could be potentially dangerous. Under this sky, this shroud falling. So under this sky, here we have the demonstrative again. The demonstrative really makes it real. It makes it right here in your face. Because if you think about demonstrative, if you even think about the root of the word demonstrate, if you're demonstrating with something, you're like, you actually have the things with you. So it's like, this is that, that is this. And so here, using the demonstrative again, it makes it really real in our face. This sky, this very sky. This shroud. A shroud covers and conceals, but often we use this as a sort of covering for a dead body. And so this imagery is significant because this winter that is coming is going to engulf us all. And the question is sort of, what will it cover? So perhaps this imagery signifies how the winter is a period of resistance which will lead to the death of the apartheid regime and its oppressive policies. Perhaps we can see it in that positive way of the shroud being sort of this covering of the torturous and traumatic past of South Africa. And maybe this period of uncertainty is actually going to yield something more positive. But at the same time, it could be something negative, even just associating a shroud, death, having that negative imagery. And the following refrain, or the following line, which has the refrain, who is not frightened, it still has that air of negativity or uncertainty and worry and concern. So who is not frightened? Here we have this repeated refrain, and it really emphasizes the melancholy and the melancholic tone. It's almost like if you think of a repeated refrain, it could be like a cry of pain. It emphasizes the permeation of fear in the country. It's not just, one person feeling frightened, it's everyone. And we spoke about the default of frightened in the first stanza when we had this refrain. In every part of the city, sad women climbing onto buses, dogs barking in the street, and the children in every doorway crying. The world is so hungry, Madam's house is clean, and the women return with slow steps to the children, the street, the sky tolling like a black bell. These women are a tide of sadness. They will drown the world. Who is not frightened? So, our third stanza, a really detailed stanza. And in this stanza, we're really going to understand the theme of the disparity between the rich and the poor, and under apartheid between the races. In every part of the city, in every single part of South Africa, there's the sense of inequality. The inequality is far-reaching. It's not just concerned with one area or one group of people. It's everywhere. There's the sense of inequality, despair, disparity. Sad women climbing onto buses. So thinking about under apartheid, there were different places where different races could live. And so the city was typically reserved for white people. But they had African people working in the white areas. And so this sort of line is indicating how these women who have been working in the cities during the daytime now have to climb on buses to go far away to go to where they're allowed to live under the apartheid laws. So that's why we have in every part of the city, and now these sad women are climbing onto buses because they've done their work for the day. We're going to see later on that they're domestic workers and they are going to have to now go home to their own children far away from where they work. Sad, I think we're going to see lots of negative diction here. I'm just looking at this stanza. We have sad, we have crying, we have hungry, and that's really emphasizing the one aspect of, the one class of people under apartheid is dealing with. And we're going to see the contrast versus the other people, the white people, and how they are treated and how they are living their lives and how they're feeling. So we have this contrast. Climbing onto buses. Notice the INGs again, the participles. This is consistently happening. This is happening as the speaker is speaking. This is happening. Dogs barking in the street. So this is just a very much a typical sort of scene that we can see. And the children in every doorway crying. Notice the enjambment. The enjambment really emphasizes the continuation of the pain of this winter. And also interestingly, if you look at children, it's isolated by itself at the end of the line. it's almost in this vulnerable position. And that can emphasize, children are a vulnerable member of society. And so here they've been put at the end of the line. There's sort of no protection from the other words. So we can understand their vulnerable position, and we can say that they're crying, they're in distress. And if you think about children, they have a sort of understanding beyond what maybe adults think that they do. They have a sort of deeper understanding of the world. They can understand when something's not right, even if they can't actually verbalize this fear or this uncertainty that adults can actually verbalize. Children can feel that uncertainty, and they can, they're crying, they're clearly in distress. They can understand something's not quite right in South Africa, not quite right in their world. The world is so hungry, Madam's house is clean. This is a really interesting line to analyze, because we've had all this in German, so we've had this all like separation of lines, and now we have this line which doesn't seem to connect, because we have two completely different things going on in this line, separated by the comma. The world is so hungry. The so is really used for emphasis, and hungry, we can think about this literally, or we can think about it figuratively, because so many people in South Africa at this time, and sadly today even, are hungry. They don't have food, but we can also think about it as hungry in terms of something's missing, that the country is devoid of something. It's devoid of equality, it's devoid of humanity. And then we have this dichotomy, or this contrast, because we have the world is so hungry, and world, we can think about that as a contrast to the city, because it's the sense of the world, this entire sort of understanding of the country, or the struggle is so far reaching that it's almost like the entire world of these people is crumbling. And then we have that dichotomy, that contrast to Madam's house is clean. Madam, if you think about Madam, it's singular. This title is also a sign of power and respect and hierarchy. So we can understand the contrast between and the disparity between the life of the domestic workers, whose world is so hungry, whose entire existence is devoid of so much because they have been granted very little, and the apartheid government has oppressed and taken away so much, versus the Madam's house, singular, which shows how the apartheid system is benefiting the few over the many, and how, there's this distinct sign of hierarchy going on. So Madam's house is clean, so we can just see the complete contrast of these two ideas. We have the hungry world of the domestic workers, and then we have Madam's house is clean, which is almost like an added benefit if you can actually have food, and then you can have also a clean house, but it also signifies the role of these women as domestic workers because they clean the house. And the women return with slow steps. So these women, the domestic workers, they return, they go back to their own homes and to their own children with slow steps. That sibilant alliteration once again mimics the heaviness of their footsteps. They have the slow pace as they walk. They are exhausted. We're going to see that later on as well. There's the sense of exhaustion. To the children, the street, the sky tolling like a black bell. So this listing really emphasizes their exhaustion. If you think about when, even when you're tired, you start listing all the different things that you have to do. And so the is really emphasizing how much or how exhausted and how tired they are. And they're going back to their own children now, to their own streets. The sky above them, it's almost like this heavenly or not spiritual necessarily, but like this powerful presence over them is tolling like a black bell alliteration, that harsh B sound, emphasizing the sort of terrible situation that they're in, this sort of really oppressive. And the black bell tolling is sort of like a signifier once again of time running out, things happening, despair being marked. And then we have the semicolon, and so now we're going to see we're going to have a comment. So earlier on we've had this description of what's happening, and now the semicolon indicates a separation, and now we're going to get into a commentary on what's just happened. These women are a tide of sadness. So here is a metaphor. The tide refers back to that natural image earlier of the sea churning. Also notice, if you think of a tide, it's a sense of overwhelming. If you think about like a tidal wave or a tide coming in the ocean, it's really overwhelming. They are so sad that the sadness has turned into despondency almost. I think it's also interesting that this speaker has used the word sad, because obviously when we're analyzing poetry, we're looking at so every single word, every single punctuation mark, and the wording and the diction is so important. And theoretically, there are many synonyms for sad, right? We could use many more fancy words for sad, but she's used sad and sadness in the stanza. And that simple word, a simple emotion, it becomes so profound because she's used such a simple word. And it's really appropriate in this case. It's not the sense of anyone's being dramatic. It's not like, oh, they're despondent or they're sort of traumatized even. The use of the sad just makes it just emphasizes how they're not being dramatic. It's not for show. It's just this intense depressive sadness that overwhelms them. It's this They're just ostensibly sad. There's nowhere else. There's no other way to almost say it, in the sense that it's just such a deep, profound sadness that has been elicited as a result of their distress and their circumstance. They will drown the world. So here we have more water imagery again. So we had the tide, we had now drowning, and this sense of this sadness is so desperate, it's going to drown the entire world. So notice the hyperbole here, which emphasizes the sadness. Obviously, no amount of sadness or no one can really drown the world per se. So this hyperbole is used for emphasis. It's also the allusion to the earlier statement. We had obviously the churning and the broken waves, but we also had the shroud, which is the sense of concealment. And so if you drown something, you are concealing it. And if you think about where world was used earlier in this poem, it was used the world is so hungry. And so they're trying to there's the sense of concealment of the pain and of the issues. Who is not frightened? Here's our repetition of the refrain once again for emphasis. So just notice as we go through the poem, each stanza is linked by the refrain. And it's almost each stanza is referencing a different part of society or a different element of the struggle. And it's almost like whoever you are, whatever the issue is, you are frightened of this upheaval, you are worrying about this extended metaphor of the winter, you are worrying about this uncertainty ahead. On every corner, men standing, old stumps in the rain, tombstones engraved with open eyes, watching the bright cars full of sated faces. Past them, past them, past them. Who is not frightened? Alright, so in this stanza, we are now going to focus on the men. In the previous stanza, we're focusing on the women. Now we're focusing on the men and their despairing situation. On every corner, every emphasizes how widespread this issue is. It's not just one man who's struggling, every single corner. There are men standing. And so we can think of these men as beggars or men looking for work. There's this sense of there's no opportunity left. There's nothing that they can do to solve the situation except stand on the corner and hope for someone to offer them a job or offer them compensation. And I think it's interesting, it doesn't specify the age of the men. And then in the next line, they are compared to old stumps in the rain. And so it's almost like this generalization of all of these men, no matter how old or how young they are so despondent and are in such a terrible situation that they all seem like old stumps. So this is a metaphor. If you think of a tree stump is old, it's knocked down. There's this attempt of it being destroyed. It's a really dehumanizing metaphor if you're comparing someone to an old stump, because a stump is what's left over sort of after the tree has been cut down. And so it's not an image of opportunity, it's not associated with anything good. It's almost just been left behind in the rain. The image of the rain again, I think, just really emphasizes the sort of enveloping nature of winter, how it completely sort of engulfs every person, the sense of uncertainty. Tombstones engraved with open eyes. Once again, notice the enjambment, that the use of tombstones implies that they're already dead in some capacity, because you put a tombstone on a gravesite where someone has died. So it's almost like these men, their opportunities have died. They are lost. They don't have a sort of direction to attain life or opportunity again. Engraved with open eyes. If something's engraved, it's set in stone. It's almost set in stone now that their lives are over, and which really emphasizes the sense of helplessness, that there's this intense sense of pessimism, that this lack of opportunity and this lack of light in their lives cannot be reversed, it cannot be changed. And so we can see here in this stanza, the men are sort of unmoving. There's no opportunity. They're incredibly despondent. The women are moving in the previous stanza. There's this tide, but what's sort of moving is the sadness, because it's the tide of sadness. And then so we have this contrast between the women and the men, but ultimately both are traumatic and despairing situations and circumstances with open eyes. And so this is the sort of contrast, because you have the tombstones engraved, and then now open eyes sort of is like, hold on, maybe they're actually alive, but they're even more desperate and sad because they've been watching their lives sort of derail and fall apart. They don't have rights. They need to fight for everything in their lives. And they are fighting against these people. And who are these people? Going to the next line. The bright cars full of sated faces, this complete disparity, this white upper class that is completely does not understand their circumstances and is also not willing to help. They are watching the bright cars. Look at the diction here that is used. Bright and sated, full. This is positive diction. It's showing this completely different, this complete contrast to what we've just described about the men standing on the corner. Full is the sense of abundance. Sated means satisfied. So it's this contrast, completely different frame of reference or circumstance or situation. And now we have this line, which is past them, past them, past them. Notice the exclusive pronoun of them. Exclusive meaning it does not include the speaker, or does not include the men. So them, you can think of the difference between us versus them. It emphasizes this distinction, this disparity, this difference between the people in the cars versus the people in the corner. The fact that it's repeated just emphasizes how many people pass them by and don't alleviate their plight. It reinforces the uncaring attitude that is effervescent in the 1980s in the country. The enjambment in this poem really emphasizes also the continuation of these men's plight, of their struggle. Who is not frightened? Once again, our refrain. Into the rain the children are running. Thin as the barest twigs they kindle a fire to fight the winter. The bare bodies of raging fire of dead children, and the sky collapsing under centuries of rain. The wind like a mountain crying, who is not frightened of this winter coming upon us now? So this last stanza, a really powerful stanza. Into the rain and the children are running. So into the rain, once again, that sense of the winter is engulfing everyone. They're in the midst of this winter already. The children, we think of connotations of children, innocent, vulnerable. They're running, and this is a very sort of different approach to the adults, right? We've seen the women sort of walking slowly. We've seen the men standing still. The women are, and the children, are running. Are they running out of fear? Are they running out of sort of fun? They don't know what's going on? That's a sort of question to ask yourself. Thin as the barest twigs, they kindle a fire. So here we have a simile. They are so thin. And we can think of these, if you want a different word for thin, you can think malnourished, emaciated. And this simile just really emphasizes how hungry they are, how thin they are. Then is the barest twigs. If you think of a twig, it's really, really tiny, it's really, really thin. And barest, it's like totally naked, and it really emphasizes the sort of exposed and vulnerable nature of these children. They're not in a protected scenario at all. Based on, the fact that they're so thin, they really don't have much protection against the winter. They kindle a fire to fight the winter. The alliteration of the F sound imitates the ferocity of the fire, the fire sort of burning, the flames. To fight the winter. So the winter, as we spoke about, the winter is representative of this uncertainty. And this winter is so threatening, it's so dangerous, when what it represents, that it must be fought. The bare bodies, a raging fire of dead children. The bare bodies, notice the BB alliteration, it emphasizes the vulnerability of the children, and bare linking to barest, linking to the sort of exposed nature of the children. A raging fire. Now, if you think of raging, raging is a really violent word. There's a sense of urgency, right? If there's a raging fire, you have to do something. You have to go and fight it. Notice fire is repeated, so it's this repeated symbol. And what does fire represent? It can represent anger, it can represent passion, destruction, determination, all these different things. It's a symbol of powerful or power of control. And then if we look at the image of dead children, that's a really, really shocking image to be putting there, a raging fire of dead children. And we can see this as an allusion, as a reference to perhaps the Soweto uprising. And we can understand this because of this image, we can understand this stanza, or what the children's role is in this poem, is to show that the children are the ones who are sort of leading the resistance movement. If you think of the Soweto uprising, that was high school students that were campaigning and fighting, and lots of historians will tell you that the Soweto uprising was the beginning of the end of apartheid. And so the dead children, the imagery of that, shows how much these children have actually sacrificed and how much they are driving this period of uncertainty, which is going to lead to, a new South Africa ultimately. And so the children seem to be the ones who are, fighting the apartheid government, burning the fires, making the fires, and fighting against this oppression. And the sky collapsing under centuries of rain. Think about the sky. The sky is a symbol of power or control. So in this case, in this example, in this line, it could perhaps indicate the apartheid government as the symbol of power, because now the symbol of power is collapsing. Collapsing is also a really dangerous and violent process as something collapses. And to abolish the oppression, and this links to what we said earlier about perhaps, we have this season of winter, this season of uncertainty and violence, because in order to enact positive change, maybe we need some sort of big thing to happen beforehand, a period where there might be violence and uncertainty and oppression. And so here, this idea of collapsing has negative connotations, but ultimately the sky collapsing in this case is a positive thing because it's the sense of the apartheid government falling. And centuries of rain. Centuries of rain. You think about rain as sort of the oppressive politics that the sky has sort of been wielding and upon South Africans, right? So you think of like the sky as the apartheid government, and the rain coming down as all these oppressive policies and all of this violence. And centuries. And I think it's interesting because at first glance I was like, maybe this could be hyperbole because, apartheid hasn't gone on for centuries. But actually we can see this not as hyperbole, but just as racist oppression in general, because even though apartheid only started in 1948, the custom of racist policies extends way back, into colonial period and even pre-colonial period in South Africa. So the use of centuries emphasizes the magnitude and longevity of the oppression and the endurance and the resilience of the resistors. The wind like a mountain crying. A really interesting line over here because we have sort of two natural images being compared to each other with the simile. We also have a mountain crying, which is personification, because a mountain can't actually cry. That's sort of a human emotion or human action. And I think the crying could be a play on the word raining. And in this case, this rain is painful because what the rain represents is something incredibly painful. So it's not just raining, but the mountain's crying. So the wind like a mountain crying, if you think about the connotation of a mountain, it's strong and immovable. And so if a mountain is crying, it emphasizes how no one is immune to the pain and struggle that is imminently approaching, that this winter coming is even going to affect the mountain, sort of the strongest, this fortitude, everyone's going to be impacted. And if you also think about the wind travels, and it's almost like this wind, this crying or this desperation or this winter of uncertainty is traveling all over, and it transports the mountains crying all over South Africa. Who is not frightened of this winter coming upon us now? And so here we have a slight change to the refrain, but we still have the real refrain there, but we just have a slight change, the extension of the refrain actually, which he asks again, who is not frightened? And using the word coming, this present participle once again, it's approaching and now emphasizes the imminent arrival of struggle. Now the question posed is absolutely rhetorical. No one could possibly not be scared. So at the beginning, when she's going through this refrain, she's sort of like questioning, making us think. Now at the end of this, after going through all these different stanzas, we are like 100% convinced that this, that everyone is scared, that being frightened, that being not frightened is a real like 1% exception of people. Everyone is feeling worried at the sense of uncertainty that's coming upon South Africa. So in this last stanza, we can think of the literal. The poverty and the bad conditions are so cold, and the sort of coldness of winter makes the children want to light a fire, even though it's dangerous. But we can also understand in the figurative that sort of adults maybe cower away from resistance, or not cower away, but maybe are not so. We know that the youth are more radical than the older people, and so maybe adults are more immovable, but the children rise up against the winter. They rise up against the uncertainty, against the oppression of apartheid, and they want to fight for their futures. And they're going to fight by using fires, by using their determination, their passion, their anger for what's going on to fight against this winter, to fight against the oppression of apartheid. So in terms of our structure, we have lots of enjambment, as we've discussed. We have no rhyme scheme in this poem. It's a free verse poem. And I think that really emphasizes how unpredictable and uncertain this period is. And that's what the whole poem is about, this season or this period in South African history being incredibly, incredibly unpredictable. And so the lack of a rhyme scheme, as readers, we're like, where's the rhyme scheme? We don't know sort of what's coming. And that imitates how South Africans felt during the 1980s. The repeated refrain with the question mark keeps on reminding us to be frightened. The tone of this poem could be described as fearful, foreboding, distressing, pensive, solemn, and ominous. And the mood could be foreboding, uncertainty, anticipation. The theme and the message: oppression, apartheid, violence, resistance, imminent danger, defiance and fear, inescapable danger during a necessary period of change. And it sort of acts as this warning to us about this unpredictable winter season that is coming, whether that's literal or figurative. I really hope you found that helpful. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like this video and to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.